before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Like this story? Drop a comment, if you dare. This isn't just any true crime tale. It's the kind that stays in your head long after the lights go out. The night air in Holcomb, Kansas, was thick with the smell of dry earth and freshly cut corn. On the outskirts of the town, a lone farmhouse sat under the sickly yellow glare of a flickering porch light. Inside, the cluttered kitchen was quiet. Too quiet. The stillness was broken only by the distant howl of a dog and the soft ticking of a clock. But peace was an illusion, a fragile veil that had been ripped away in the most brutal way imaginable. By dawn, detectives would stumble upon a scene that would haunt them for years. The cluttered farmhouse, home to the Clutter family, was no longer a sanctuary. Blood streaked the walls. Drawers hung open, torn from their hinges. In the main living room, the bodies of Herb and Bonnie Clutter lay sprawled across the floor, victims of a merciless attack. The horror was compounded by the murder of their teenage children, Nancy and Kenyon. There was no sign of forced entry, no clear motive, just a cold imprint of violence that left the town trembling. Newspapers would later call it the perfect crime, but perfection had a dark, unsettling symmetry. Whoever had done this was methodical, patient, almost clinical. The sheriff, Alvin Dewey, stood in the doorway that morning, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He had seen his fair share of tragedy in small-town Kansas. But this was different. The investigation began immediately. Neighbors were interviewed, and forensics combed the scene for any shred of evidence that could point to the killers. A single, small clue was overlooked by most, something that would eventually unravel the story completely. In a corner of the Clutter house, a cigarette, but still warm, had been left behind. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Across the country, in a New York City apartment filled with the hum of typewriters and the faint aroma of ink, Truman Capote read the dispatches. Known for his literary elegance and flamboyant social presence, Capote's curiosity was piqued in a way that few other cases ever managed. He had a fascination with the darkness that lived inside people, their secrets, their hidden desires, and the capacity for unimaginable cruelty. As the story of the Clutter murders unfolded in front of him, he saw more than tragedy. He saw a story waiting to be told, a story that demanded to be understood, dissected, and chronicled in excruciating detail. Capote would not tackle this story alone. Alongside him was Harper Lee, a quiet but fiercely intelligent writer who shared his obsession with human psychology. Together, they traveled to Holcomb, Kansas, stepping into a town that had become a mausoleum overnight. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak of a floorboard feel deafening. Residents avoided eye contact, their lives suspended in the shadow of fear and suspicion. At the sheriff's office, Dewey met Capote with guarded curiosity. Here was a man with charm and elegance, clearly out of place among the sweat-stained uniforms and muddy boots of the Holcomb police. But Capote's interest was sincere, and Dewey, despite his reservations, found himself reluctantly cooperating. Capote wanted everything: the minutiae of the investigation, the personal details of the Clutter's lives, and most disturbingly, access to the men who had committed the murders. Weeks passed. Leads were scarce. The townspeople's whispers circled like vultures around the skeletal remains of their shattered community. Then came a breakthrough. A set of fingerprints, a witness who remembered seeing two men loitering near the outskirts of town the night of the murders. Richard Dick Hickock and Perry Smith, drifters with criminal histories and a penchant for violence, were soon identified as the prime suspects. The net was tightening, and Dewey felt the weight of the case pressing down like a vice. When Hickock and Smith were finally arrested, Capote sensed the gravity of the opportunity before him. These were not mere criminals. They were complex, dangerous, and terrifyingly human. Capote's fascination with them bordered on obsession. Unlike the typical reporter who reported facts from a distance, Capote wanted to peer into the soul of the killers, understand what drove them, and capture in his words. In the confines of the county jail, Capote began his interactions with the men. Hickock was the easier of the two to read. Charming in a shallow, almost grotesque way, eager to perform for an audience, even one as unusual as Capote. Perry Smith was different. He carried a storm behind his eyes, a mixture of fear, anger, and intelligence that made him unpredictable. Their conversations were tense, probing, and sometimes frightening. Smith's story shifted between confessions and half-truths, teasing Capote into deciphering a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. The deeper Capote delved, the more he realized that this was no ordinary crime story. Hickock and Smith had committed the murders for a reason so senseless it was almost unreal. They believed there was a safe full of cash in the Clutter home. There was none. The reality of the crime, stripped of any rational motive, was more terrifying than fiction. And yet, Capote found himself empathizing in ways that disturbed him. The killer's humanity, their regrets, their insecurities, their past traumas, clashed violently with the horror of what they had done. As Capote pieced together interviews, police reports, and first-hand observations, he started noticing patterns, anomalies, and contradictions that hinted at a deeper, darker layer of the story. Letters, hidden diaries, and subtle details in the Clutter family's interactions painted a picture of quiet vulnerability, of a family unprepared for the intrusion of pure evil. Yet the more Capote learned, the more dangerous his work became. Certain townspeople were hostile, rumors spread like wildfire, and there were nights when Capote felt eyes watching from the cornfields, a lingering paranoia born of proximity to true violence. The morning sun barely touched the horizon as Capote returned to the Holcomb sheriff's office, the letter and photographs from the previous night burning a hole in his mind. Dewey was already there, hunched over his desk, surrounded by maps of Kansas and dozens of mugshots. The sheriff's normally steady hands trembled as he shuffled papers. Something in the air told Capote that today, the investigation would take a turn unlike anything either of them expected. The locked drawer in Perry Smith's cell had revealed a notebook, worn and battered, the edges frayed from years of handling. Inside were fragments of Smith's past, sketches of trains, cryptic notes, and references to family members he had never spoken of publicly. Most disturbingly, there were passages that hinted at an obsession with control, dominance, and revenge, not random acts of violence, but calculated, almost ritualistic cruelty. Capote could feel the darkness seeping through the pages. He was no stranger to human depravity, but reading Smith's words felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. Harper Lee, who had accompanied him that morning, leaned over his shoulder, her voice barely audible. He's planning something beyond what we know. The implication was chilling. If Smith's writings were accurate, then the Clutter murders were only the beginning. Someone, maybe more than just Smith and Hickock, had been preparing, scheming, studying the vulnerabilities of unsuspecting towns. Capote's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a murder story anymore. It was a portrait of premeditated chaos, a glimpse into minds that were terrifyingly aware of the havoc they could inflict. Later that day, Capote visited the county jail again. Hickock and Smith were separated in their cells, but both sensed his arrival. Hickock smiled, a glint of vanity in his eyes, as though he knew Capote was both observer and confidant. "You really think you can get me to talk, Mr. Capote?" he said, leaning back against the bars. "I know what you're after." Capote's eyes narrowed. He didn't flinch. "I'm not here for judgment. I'm here to understand. You and Perry. People will never see what I see, but I will write it. All of it." Hickock's smirk faltered slightly, and Capote noted the subtle twitch in his jaw. He could sense fear behind bravado, the fear of being truly known. Then there was Perry Smith. Unlike Hickock, Smith didn't perform. He studied Capote with a predator's caution, his eyes dark pools of emotion, anger, and pain. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice low, almost whispering. "People like me, people like him, we're just animals to you. You think you understand us." Capote leaned closer, careful with his words. "I don't think I understand you yet, but I want to. I want the truth, every word of it. No lies." Smith laughed softly, a sound that made Capote's stomach knot. "Truth," he said. "There's more truth in a lie than in anything you will ever write." Their conversations continued for weeks. Hickock, ever the chatterer, revealed small details, half-truths that often contradicted Perry's own accounts. Capote learned to navigate the lies, the embellishments, the theatrical confessions. But it was Smith who haunted him, intensely private, capable of sudden rages, but also a moment of vulnerability that made Capote question morality, justice, and the meaning of evil itself. One night, After leaving the jail, Capote walked the empty streets of Holcomb with Harper Lee. The town was cloaked in shadows, the cornfields rustling like a living thing. Capote's thoughts were heavy with Smith's notebook, with the knowledge that the killers had carefully constructed their path of destruction. Harper, what if there's more? What if they aren't done, even behind bars? Lee shook her head, uneasy. They're caught. The law's on it. That has to be enough. Capote didn't respond. He knew better. Evil, once unleashed, often leaves footprints that are invisible to everyone but those willing to look closely. Back at the sheriff's office, another shocking revelation emerged. A tip had arrived anonymously, claiming that a local man had been seen helping Hickock and Smith plan their crime. The town, already reeling, was stunned. Everyone knew everyone. Betrayal was personal, but the alleged accomplice, a mechanic with a clean record, denied everything. Yet his fingerprints matched some of the items left at the Clutter house, and his alibi was thin. Dewey's team scrambled, and Capote was pulled into the investigation more directly than ever before. Capote's obsession grew. He wasn't just recording a story. He was living it, analyzing body language, unspoken words, and subtle hints from the killer's behavior. He started to feel the weight of their presence, even when they were miles away. Hickock's bravado and Smith's inner darkness followed him into every room, every conversation, and every sleepless night. Then came the moment that escalated the danger to a terrifying level. A package arrived at the sheriff's office, addressed to Capote. Inside was a photograph of the Clutter house, taken after the murders, with someone's handwriting scrawled across the back. We're still here, watching. Capote felt the chill of fear rise from his chest. Someone had been observing, tracking. Even after the killers were imprisoned, was it Hickock and Smith, or someone connected to them? The question gnawed at him. Every day in Holcomb now carried the possibility of unseen eyes, and Capote began to feel hunted. The threat became immediate when Dewey received word that a key witness, a neighbor who had seen Hickock and Smith before murders, had disappeared. His car was found abandoned on a dirt road outside town. The investigation into his disappearance revealed disturbing signs. Tire tracks leading into the woods, a torn piece of clothing caught on a fence, and a note hastily written that read, "Stay out of it." Capote realized that the story had moved beyond letters, notebooks, and jail interviews. Lives were at stake, and the killer's influence seemed to extend beyond prison walls. He wondered if he had underestimated the danger of his proximity. Each note, each photograph, each whispered secret brought him closer to the edge. One evening, Capote returned to the hotel to find Harper Lee already awake, pacing. "They're watching us," she said flatly, almost in disbelief. "I can feel it." Capote's heart raced. He had felt the same thing, an intangible pressure, a creeping paranoia that turned shadows into threats. But he had to continue. The truth was out there, and he had to uncover it before someone else was hurt, or worse. Days later, an unexpected breakthrough shifted the investigation again. Hickock and Smith, despite their imprisonment, had communicated through letters smuggled from the jail, suggesting a deeper network of accomplices or admirers. These letters hinted at previous unsolved crimes eerily similar to the Clutter murders. Capote pored over each line, cross-referencing timelines, locations, and descriptions. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Hickock and Smith were not isolated criminals, but part of a broader web of violence and manipulation. Then the ultimate shock. While going through Perry Smith's personal effects, Capote discovered a photograph that had been carefully hidden behind a false panel in his notebook. A photograph of a young woman, smiling, her face familiar yet haunting. Handwritten on the back were the words, "She saw too much." Capote's stomach churned. The implication was clear. Someone connected to the Clutter murders, or someone who had crossed Smith before, had paid the ultimate price. The case was no longer just about the Clutter family. It was about a pattern of predation that threatened anyone who looked too closely. As the days turned into nights filled with tense interviews and cryptic discoveries, Capote's sense of urgency became almost unbearable. The town of Holcomb seemed to shrink around him, the cornfields closing in like walls. He knew that the next revelation would be explosive, potentially life-changing or life-ending. And then, as if fate had been waiting for the perfect moment, Capote received a tip from an unknown source. A witness, claiming knowledge of Hickock and Smith's movements before the Clutter murders, agreed to meet him at a secluded diner outside town. Capote arrived early, his pulse quickening with every passing minute. He scanned the parking lot, noting the way shadows stretched across cracked pavement. When the man finally arrived, he looked ordinary, unassuming, almost timid, but his eyes held a weight that suggested knowledge of horror Capote could barely imagine. "You want to know why they did it?" the man said quietly. "And why it's not over? You're not ready for the truth. None of us are." Capote leaned forward, every instinct screaming that he was on the edge of a revelation that could shatter everything he thought he knew. The man reached into his coat and handed him a folded envelope. Capote's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were photographs, notes, and maps that detailed other potential targets, other victims, other secrets that the killers had kept hidden even from the law. Capote's mind reeled. This was no longer just a story. It was a warning. The killers reached their intelligence, and their planning were far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. And the most terrifying part? They knew he was watching. The diner's neon sign buzzed above, casting an eerie glow on Capote's face. Outside, the wind whispered to the empty streets, carrying the faint, unmistakable sense that the killer's story was far from over. Because when Capote returned to his hotel that night and opened his door, he found the envelope from the diner sitting on his bed, but he had never brought it inside. Cliffhanger. The envelope contained a single photograph. Hickock and Smith outside the Clutter home, smiling at the camera, but behind them, almost invisible, was a figure Capote recognized instantly. Someone who was supposed to be dead. Capote's hands shook as he stared at the photograph on his hotel bed. The image was almost surreal. Hickock and Smith grinning casually in front of the Clutter house, while in the background, partially obscured by shadow, was a figure he knew instantly, a man long believed dead, a former accomplice who had vanished from Kansas months before the murders, presumed killed in a botched robbery. And yet here he was, smiling, watching, involved. Capote felt a chill that wasn't just fear, it was a premonition. Something in his gut told him that this revelation would unravel everything he thought he knew about the case. Harper Lee, standing behind him, mirrored his tension. "That's impossible," she said. "He's dead. He couldn't have been there." But Capote didn't respond. He already knew better. Nothing about Hickock and Smith had ever been simple. The killer's brilliance and terror lay in their ability to manipulate, deceive, and vanish into shadows, leaving only carnage and confusion behind. The next morning, Capote returned to the sheriff's office. Dewey was waiting, his face grim, coffee untouched. "We've got to see this through," he said, gesturing toward the photograph. "If your instincts are right, there's more to this than just the Clutters." Capote nodded. They gathered maps, cross-referenced old leads, and began retracing the movements of Hickock, Smith, and the mysterious figure. What emerged was a chilling pattern. The Clutters were not random victims. They had been carefully selected, their homes scouted in advance. The motive wasn't money. It was spectacle, a calculated escalation of violence. And the figure in the photograph wasn't just a witness. He had orchestrated elements of the crime, manipulating Hickock and Smith from the shadows. That afternoon, Capote sat across from Perry Smith, whose eyes seemed to pierce the walls of the jail. Capote laid the photograph on the table, careful not to show the face of the third man. "Did anyone help you?" he asked quietly. "Anyone you haven't told the sheriff?" Smith's hand shook slightly. He stared at the photo, his breathing uneven. "There was someone," he admitted finally. "Someone I trusted. I didn't think he'd—" His voice faltered. "I didn't think he'd." Hickock, ever performer, smirked from his separate cell during a brief confrontation. "You know, Capote," he said, leaning casually against the bars. "Perry likes to keep secrets, but some secrets, they're worse than the truth." Capote's pulse raced. He realized that Hickock and Smith had been playing a deeper game than he had imagined. Their confessions, their interviews, and even their apparent remorse had been carefully curated. The real story was hidden behind layers of deception, and Capote, now deeply entangled, was on the precipice of uncovering it. That night, Capote returned to his hotel room, clutching Smith's notebook. He flipped through pages, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might reveal the identity of the mysterious third figure. And then, buried in the margins of a sketch of a train, he found it. Initials, small and almost invisible, written in Perry's handwriting. The initials matched the man in the photograph. Capote felt the room spin. This was no longer just a murder case. It was a conspiracy, a web of manipulation, betrayal, and hidden violence. And if he didn't act carefully, someone would die again. The following day, Dewey organized a raid on the man's last known residence, a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. Capote accompanied the sheriff. The tension in the car almost tangible. Every mile, every shadow felt like a threat. The farmhouse loomed ahead, quiet, almost serene in the winter sunlight. But the silence was deceptive. Inside, the scene was eerily meticulous. No signs of struggle, no immediate evidence of wrongdoing, but traces of planning were everywhere. Maps pinned to walls, notes scattered across tables, and a rifle leaning against a chair. Capote's stomach churned. This was the lair of someone dangerous, someone who had been orchestrating violence from behind the scenes. Then, in the corner of the room, they found a stack of letters. Capote picked one up, hands trembling, and read aloud. The letters contained detailed instructions for Hickock and Smith, timelines, and even contingency plans if they were caught. The third figure had been their puppeteer, shaping events from the shadows, ensuring that chaos unfolded exactly as he intended. The realization hit Capote like a physical blow. The Clutter murders were only one act in a series of crimes orchestrated by a mastermind whose reach extended far beyond Kansas. The killers, charming and dangerous as they were, had been instruments of someone else's vision of terror. Back in the sheriff's office, Capote confronted Perry Smith with the letters. Smith's face was pale, his hands trembling. He told me it was just a test, Smith whispered. He said if I could do it, if I could really, then I was worthy. I thought I was doing it for us. For me and Dick. But it was never just us. Hickock, upon seeing the letters, laughed nervously. So we're the bad guys, but not really, he said. Just puppets. Figures in someone else's story. That's rich. Capote knew that the story had shifted from crime reporting to moral reckoning. The killers were human, but the puppet master behind them was something else entirely. Cold, calculating, and far more terrifying than either Hickock or Smith could ever be. The trial proceeded, but the focus shifted subtly. Capote's book was shaping into something unprecedented. Not just a recounting of events, but a study of evil, manipulation, and the fragile boundary between innocence and cruelty. Capote interviewed Hickock and Smith endlessly, capturing every confession, every flicker of emotion, every hidden truth. As execution day approached, Capote felt the weight of his work pressing down. He had become deeply connected to the killers, understanding them in a way that terrified him. Perry Smith, in particular, haunted him. The rage, the vulnerability, and the raw intelligence that no one else seemed to recognize. Capote wrestled with the ethical and emotional consequences of humanizing monsters, knowing that the public would see only the final act. 2 men on death row. The night before the execution, Capote visited Perry Smith one last time. Smith was calm, almost serene, yet the tension in his eyes betrayed the storm within. "Do you think they'll understand me?" he asked quietly. Capote paused. "I hope they'll understand a part of you. Not the part that killed, but the part that suffered, that was human, that felt everything too deeply." Smith nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face. Then maybe it wasn't all in vain. The executions were swift, clinical, and final. Hickock and Smith were gone, leaving behind only memories, confessions, and Capote's meticulously detailed account. But the revelation of the third figure, his orchestration, his hidden influence, remained unresolved. Capote's investigation suggested that the man had vanished, disappearing once again into the shadows, leaving no trace. The notion that evil could exist beyond the law, unseen and unpunished, lingered like a shadow over Capote's work. Capote returned to New York, his manuscript nearly complete. The book, in cold blood, would become a landmark in literature, a chilling portrait of murder, obsession, and the human psyche. But even as he typed the final words, Capote felt the weight of what he had uncovered. The killers had been instruments, but the true darkness, the manipulator, the orchestrator, remained free, lurking beyond the reach of justice. Years later, Capote reflected on his time in Holcomb. The town had recovered, the Clutter's memory honored, and the killers long gone. Yet the shadows of that winter lingered in his mind. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that evil was rarely straightforward. It was complex, hidden, and terrifyingly human, and sometimes it existed in ways no one could anticipate, behind faces that appeared ordinary. And then, as if to remind him of that haunting truth, Capote received a letter. No return address, no signature. Inside, a single line was written, "You look too closely. Watch your back." Capote folded the letter, a cold shiver running down his spine. Even decades later, even after the book, even after the world had moved on, he knew the truth. Evil never dies. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it strikes again in ways no one sees coming. The killers were gone, but their story, the story of violence, manipulation, and human darkness, was immortalized. And for Truman Capote, the cost of understanding it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Final twist. They thought the killers were behind bars. But the shadow of the true mastermind lingered, leaving Capote and the world aware that the line between observer and participant, between justice and danger, was far thinner than anyone had imagined. If you thought this story ended, think again. Evil doesn't stay confined. And Capote's journey proves that sometimes understanding the darkness comes at the highest price.